Welcome to the DEC4 podcast. You can access episodes, companion articles, research notes and links, as well as information about our contributors and supporters at dec4podcast.com. Hope you enjoy the program. Gary, great to see you. Thank you for coming on. Great to be able to do a podcast face-to-face again.
Yeah, no problem. It's good to see you too. I'm happy to be here.
So we're here to have a bit of a talk about the last episode we did, which we recorded separately on the Winter Dance Party. When we were putting the episode together, was there anything that in our research that either changed your mind or made you rethink perhaps something that you already knew or thought about?
Well, I certainly had not considered GAC's role in the scheduling and the logistics of the touring with the buses and the time of year and all that. That gave me a lot of pause and made me, really consider both sides of that story and factoring in the times and the way things were. You know, it's easy, like I said before, to say that GAC blew it with the scheduling and the buses. And I guess, they really did. It's just, I'm always thinking of the times and people, history not having evolved enough yet, people just not learning stuff. So the hard lessons of the Winter Dance Party hopefully made it easier on performers going forward. Maybe a guy like Dion would be able to compare the nightmare of the Winter Dance Party logistics with future packages he was involved in or tours that he did. I think that was maybe one of the main things. And your extensive research into the people on the ground, the gentlemen that hosted the events and the disc jockeys that were there. And it made me consider these peripheral players and the humanity involved, the friendships and the relationships that were forged and the aftermath of the deaths and what that would do to not only the family, but to these people that had this, this special time with them. So those were a few things that I can think of that really hit home for me.
That was something that I really took away from it as well, learning about people like Bob Hale, who was the MC and the DJ, and yes, Carol Anderson, these guys that really just went above and beyond to make everybody feel welcome and take care of them. And one thing that I loved about the whole show, and one of the quotes that we referred to with Bob Hale when he was recalling the Winter Dance Party, this was in an interview that he did in 2019, and he was talking about how before the show, Buddy Holly and Ritchie Valens and JP all came out and mingled with the crowd and actually, sat down at the booths and drank sodas with the kids and all of that sort of stuff. And I thought that was very impressive, and just how also they rose above their own exhaustion and illness and general sense of disillusionment about the tour, and were really just these consummate professionals in their performance and their demeanor.
Yeah, really good point. So buried in the heart of this tragic and historic event is these little remembrances of a simpler time and the more down-homeness of a show like that, and to think of the stars mingling with the regular folks, would have made an impression on them too. So no wonder these kids were beside themselves. This was such an early experience for them, I'm sure, for a lot of them, of death, losing a hero and losing three of them in such a horrific sort of way. So while that part is wonderful, it certainly made things probably a little bit more difficult for these kids in the aftermath.
Yeah, most definitely. And also the fact, too, that Carol Anderson invited the parents the parents were there as well. And the parents got to meet the artists. And it's just, I don't know, there's just something just so nice about the whole thing.
Really nice and really simple, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. One thing that got me thinking was what you said about General Artists Corporation and looking at them in the context of the time. And that got me thinking about touring really was, as you alluded to, in its infancy. And when you look back, country artists on the honky-tonk circuit and even Elvis and Jerry Lee Lewis and all of these guys were basically strapping instruments to the roof rack of a car and sort of off they went. So it was a very rudimentary sort of situation. The days of private jets and these huge big touring operations were a long way in the future. And it's interesting to look at it in the context of the time. I remember there was an interview with Jerry Lee Lewis, and it was years ago. I haven't heard it for years, and I might not be getting it entirely correct, but in this interview he said he was off on a tour. It might have even been a package with Johnny Cash and Carl Perkins, and he basically said that, when he started the tour, he had a brand new car, and it was, everything was great, and by the end of the tour his car was wrecked, and he was exhausted and had no more money, and really that he had what he set out. Now, it was a very different time, and there was no model for the touring, or no experience.
No, I think your point is well taken, the Jerry Lee point, because even having somebody to book the things might have been, space age to these guys. Yeah. Wow, we don't have to do it ourselves, So to have a staff of any sort, to have a crew, it might have been something, oh, don't worry, General Artist is looking after it. We don't have to sacrifice our vehicles like Jerry Lee did. So you're right. The times and the context is important.
Having said that, of course, I think the major criticism is the way it was not organised well in terms of doubling back and travelling, vast distances to go somewhere and then back, and just crisscrossing without any sense of organisation, which must have been very, very frustrating. So there's no real excuse for that, no excuse for the lack of support on the road and even the basics. In an interview, Carl Bunch, which I'm going to allude to a little later, said, most nights they stayed on the bus. They very rarely even stayed in a hotel. I guess we can defend them to a point, but there was still a lot wrong with the way it was organised.
There's no question. We can discuss, like we said, the context and the ramifications of the wrongness, but there's no doubt that it was wrong. And let's just hope, well, I guess they did learn from such craziness, and just map reading would be rudimentary, would be good.
Yes, exactly.
Going forward, yeah,
exactly. Now, one thing that we did speak about in the original episode, was this decision to exhume the body of JP Richardson for another autopsy that was ordered by JP Richardson's son. And I just discovered a little bit of additional context to this. So this is from the Orange County Record. Richardson had been buried at Forest Lawn Cemetery in his hometown of Beaumont. In 2007, a decision was made to move his body and that of his wife, Teetsy, to another section of the cemetery. The Texas Historical Commission had issued a plaque, and there were plans to install a life-size statue of the Big Bopper at the gravesite. This new gravesite would be more visible and accessible. J. Richardson decided that since the body was going to be dug up and moved, it would be a good time to do an investigation and put the rumours that we spoke about to rest. So in that article, it doesn't make it clear whose initiative it actually was to exhume the body in the first place. Now, obviously, it couldn't have been done without J. Richardson's permission, you wouldn't think, but we don't know if it was his initiative or the cemetery authority. But it's just perhaps a little bit of additional context that the entire motivation might not have been the autopsy and the investigations that J. Richardson wanted to do. I don't know if that makes a huge difference.
Yeah, I don't know. It just seems that maybe it was a bit of serendipity where it was going to happen anyway. So if that's the case, then let's take a look. But I think we can still assume that J. Richardson was maybe, always thinking about it and always wondering. And maybe he was unable to make the decision to finally cross the line to dig his dad up. But once it was going to happen anyways, I'm sure he was right interested in having a second look. So as you said, in the end, it provided some closure for him. So maybe that was the whole point of it all anyways, just for him to be able to close the book on his dad.
I've just updated our webpage just with that additional context and a link to the primary article as well.
Great.
Okay, let's move on to Carl Bunch. The drummer ended up with frostbite and had to go to hospital. One of our recommended additional reads that we got on the website is a link to Buddy Holly Lives, great website, and there's a lengthy interview with Carl Bunch on the site. A fair bit about some of the band and management politics around at the time. Doesn't make necessarily comfortable reading, but there's a couple of interesting things I'm going to be interested in your opinion on. We talked about the fact that Buddy Holly had hired Waylon Jennings because Waylon was his friend. We mentioned that Waylon Jennings couldn't actually play bass and had to learn. And Carl Bunch, and this obviously didn't necessarily go down well with Tommy Allsop. This is Carl Bunch saying, I have pictures of Tommy looking at Waylon with a scowl on his face that would have frozen me stiff had he looked at me that way. I remember him saying, it's the 4 bass strings, Waylon. That's all it is, for God's sake.
Oh, boy.
So there's perhaps a little bit of tension there. Carl Bunch says, I would describe Tommy Allsop as the best musician I've ever been privileged to work with and truly a man of honour. Tommy is the best friend I've ever had in the music business. Not only did he get me my job with Buddy Holly, but he also offered me many opportunities to play with other artists by introducing me to them. Carl Bunch also worked with Waylon Jennings a little later on. That relationship is perhaps a little more complicated for various reasons. He goes into that in the interview. But here's something particularly interesting. Tommy Allsop paid for Carl Bunch's medical bills when he was taken to hospital with frostbite, and not only that, paid his airfare so he could rejoin the tour in Sioux City. Carl Bunch mentions that Tommy Allsop was actually looking after the tour money and looking after paying the musicians, but he seems to be saying here in that interview that Tommy Allsop actually paid personally for his medical bills.
So that's, I guess we can take that as one of two ways, or a little bit of both maybe. Tommy, as Carl says, Tommy is a good guy and was looking after his buddy. But at the same time, if he was actually in charge of the purse strings, it just simply might have been his job to do so. Either way, that was facilitated for Carl, as it should have been. I mean, the craziness that results in such a condition for Carl to have to go to hospital, there absolutely should have been some money spent on him to get him fixed up and back with the tour. So just another kudos to you for the research, another real deep little corner of this story that makes for fascinating contemplation. So not only did Carl get laid up in such a way, but there was Tommy helped him out by getting him back on the tour. That's some good stuff.
Carl Bunch goes on to say, and you alluded to this in the other episode, we weren't even allowed to go to the funerals. We were promised a big bonus if we would finish the tour. We never got a dime of it. So Carl Bunch goes on to say, Tommy Allsop went to New York to get their bonus money from Irvin Feld, who was the promoter. Feld said there was no money and that Maria Elena had apparently picked it up. This was another bone of contention, but Carl Bunch goes on to say, there has never been any proof that Maria Elena picked up the money that was owed to us. It was just Feld's word to Tommy, and we were in no shape to do anything about it at the time. I don't know if Tommy confronted Maria Elena back then or not. I was kept in a hotel room, not even allowed to take part in negotiations. I'm sure Tommy got whatever he could out of the deal for us. Waylon left town and then dropped the whole thing. And he also, Carl Bunch also says that Buddy Holly was actually negotiating with Irvin Feld at the time to be his new manager.
See, I'm one to not go first to the idea that people are thieves.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah.
The idea that Maria Elena would say, no, I've lost my husband. This was Buddy's money anyways, and I'm taking it all. Seems a little bit far-fetched. But again, who knows exactly? Nobody knows. All we can do is conjecture. But knowing what we know about business practices back then, I would totally believe that there was no money left and things were mismanaged. And let's face it, can any other tour be called the nightmare that this one was? I mean, resulting in the death of the headliners. So there was, who knows what else went on and what other balls were dropped. And the idea that there was no money left there for a bonus, well, I can believe that 100%. Everything else seems to have been botched. So that actually falls in line.
Feld Entertainment still exists. And it's interesting that Irvin Feld's official biography on their website makes no mention of Buddy Holly or the Winter Dance Party. Irvin's spirit lives on at Feld Entertainment in bigger-than-life dreams and the tireless pursuit to make them come true. His affinity for show business began as a child when he fell in love with a circus. As a teenager in the 30s, he worked at travelling carnivals as a snake oil salesman. His earnings led to the opening of a drugstore in Washington, D.C., where he became adept at selling records. Next, he opened a chain of record stores and started producing records and live concerts. In the 50s and 60s, Irvin became one of the most successful concert producers in America, arranging appearances for rising stars like Chubby Checker, the Everly Brothers, the Beatles, Nat King Cole, and Frank Sinatra. During this period, he also began managing the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus and bought it in 1967, which he described as the happiest moment of his life. So it's interesting there, Chubby Checker, the Everlys, the Beatles, Nat King Cole, Frank Sinatra, no mention of Buddy Holly or the Winter Dance Party.
If you're writing a bio on the website and your boy rolled with a guy the size of Buddy Holly, I would think that you would be inclined to mention that. I mean, Buddy Holly versus Chubby Checker, I would mention Buddy over Chubby any day. So they don't mention it. Why? They maybe want to just distance Irvin Feld. That's a little bit odd there too, that his bio would not mention Buddy at all. And Irvin's role in one of the biggest rock and roll stories there is, maybe his role is too controversial or indefensible, so they skirted it. That's certainly interesting.
Okay, so let's move on once again to one of our recommended reads. There was an article in the Washington Post from 1987 that I put a link to on the webpage. Donna Fox Coots, formerly Donna Ludwig, and the movie La Bamba. Now, you've written a great review on your website of La Bamba. And this article was actually quite interesting from Donna's perspective. And I tried to get back on, but I've obviously blown my whatever it is, 2 or 3 free reads without the paywall, so I couldn't get back on. But I think if anyone does want to have a look at that, you'll probably get a couple of free reads out of it before the paywall kicks in. But now she was sort of involved more or less as a producer. She said that she got involved to really help out the Valenzuela family. Once again, I mean, she just came across in this article as a very nice, kind and genuine person, like just about everybody else in this whole story. But she said that the early script actually included, fairly graphically shown sexual relationship between Ritchie Valens and Donna, and she fought very hard to get that out of it and make it a much more accurate representation, and didn't back down. And this big studio and the producers, and they sort of had to acquiesce, or they agreed to the changes. So I thought that was an interesting little side to how they wanted to represent Ritchie Valens' biography.
Well, I chalked that up to the studio, because through my research, the filmmaker Luis Valdez and Taylor Hackford, the producer, they all seem to be really in it for the authenticity of the story. I don't want to be the guy that refers back to American Graffiti all the time. Well, yeah, I'm okay being that guy. You remember the story of, Universal, they wanted a murder, they wanted car crashes, they wanted explosions, they wanted the opposite film. So the studio is always going to be wanting to sell tickets. So I can easily see the studio looking at this rock and roll picture at that time in that era, and they would want something to pop off the screen like that, and they would want to add that. So I would say that's more on the studio, and good for Donna, because not only maybe for her own reputation as a woman, as a grandmother, as a whatever she's doing in life right now, but also for authenticity. I mean, what's the point in making the film? I don't think the story Ritchie Valens' story has so much to it that it doesn't need to be embellished. So good for her. And that's another interesting story about, life stories being translated to the screen.
A very good point you make about there being enough there. Well, there's enough drama and human story about this.
Yeah.
This kid really from this very tough background, really just in such a short time, carving out such a remarkable career. And you make a great point. There's no need to make things up. I mean, the drama and everything is there.
Yeah, I mean, and I can never get away from the fact that this was a poor family struggling to make it. And then one of their number all of a sudden becomes famous. And here is a means by which to survive, to make money and live. And I won't say hitching their wagon to him, because he was their son and he was going to provide for them. But the idea that maybe we're going to have something now. Maybe we're going to get out of this poverty and this endless cycle of whatever. And that was so promising for the family. And even with his half brother Bob and the whole situation where here's a family like, so many of them struggling, trying to make ends meet. And then Ritchie is the guy that's going to make money, and he's the one that's taken away. Like there's so much story. What happens to the family afterwards? They're, of course, gutted because Mrs. Valenzuela's lost her son. But I got to wonder, in the back of everybody's mind is, like, he was our ticket out. Like, they would hate to feel that way. And I even hate to kind of say it, but that's real life. And so there is so much story to Ritchie Valens. that, yeah, you didn't have to punch it up very much.
No, and Carl Bunch actually talks about him in that interview on Buddy Holly Lives. They got on very well. Carl Bunch said, Ritchie was very quiet until he walked out on the stage, where he simply exploded. It was like he was two different people on and off stage. I wouldn't call him shy, but rather private. And I never saw a single prejudicial act happen because of his being Hispanic. And another interesting observation of Carl Bunch, he said that Ritchie Valens, JP Richardson and Buddy Holly never participated in, the after-show parties or the girls on tour or anything like that. They were devoted to their relationships, obviously in, Buddy Holly's case and JP Richardson's case. They were married. JP Richardson, of course, had a family. Buddy Holly's wife was pregnant. Ritchie Valens in this relationship with Donna. So it's interesting that they were very, very mindful of that. I thought that was interesting. And once again, it's just there is so much to admire about all of these people.
Well, yeah, and it's funny. It drives home the point that it makes it even sadder. These are three regular Joes. They were chummy with the concert promoters and the DJs and the kids and whatnot. The parents were there. And it was so nice. I can't help but make the other side of the coin being a guy I've been talking about lately, Sam Cooke, who got into a jam with a woman who was reported to have been a prostitute. The idea being that if Sam had never gone into that realm, he never would have gone into a jam type thing. And people want to say, well, you live by the sword, you die by the sword.
Yep.
But here's three young guys with mates or with families. Ritchie was quite young, let's not forget. And that's another part of the story, too, is that, regular Joes and good fellas.
So moving on from that whole situation, and once again, we've linked to this on the website, one of our suggested additional reads. Once again, it doesn't make entirely comfortable reading. Now, JP Richardson's wife, Tsitsi, remarried. She had 4 children with her second husband. And in 2004, they launched legal action against JP Richardson Jr., alleging that, quoting the article, he had tricked his ailing mother and swindled his siblings. So in the days after his mother's death, JP Richardson Jr., according to this article, sent a letter instructing a record company to send all of his father's royalties now and forever to me, quote unquote, according to the Beaumont Enterprise. There was apparently a document or a letter signed by his mother signing all of the rights to JP Richardson's music to Jay Richardson. The attorney who was representing the 4 children from Tsitsi Richardson's second marriage said the royalties were worth about $100,000 a year. The Big Bopper wrote dozens of songs, many of which no one has ever recorded but him. If some big star starts singing one of his songs, it could be worth millions. I couldn't find anything or any further notes to say whether or not that was resolved or how that was resolved.
Yeah, I don't know, man. Like, I don't know if you call it cynicism or not, but I guess grasping at straws. I mean, JP Richardson, the Big Bopper, I guess $100,000 a year is nothing to sneeze at, but how many people are we having to look after with this? And I mean, his flesh and blood son, surely he should be in charge of any of the finances after his mother dies. And even when his mother is alive, you would think that the two of them would work together on that sort of thing and manage what meager income there would be. Again, $100,000 is not exactly meager, but the 4 kids from her second marriage, I don't know. That's a bit of a tough one. The idea that JP Richardson has this big back catalog of compositions that if anybody gets hold of them, they're going to record all the songs and sell it 1 million copies, and JP Richardson's music's going to go out into the world again. That's a little bit far-fetched for me. I guess you have to get ahead of any of these things happening, because what if that does happen and you weren't on the ball, somebody else is making money off that? And I guess you have to be confident in your old man's ability to write hits, but like that's never going to happen, and that would never happen. So this money thing is always a bit of a sticky wicket. You never know who's telling the truth. Again, like I hinted at with the Valenzuela family, the Richardson family had this one guy who was going to be the income forevermore, even though he was only at it for a couple of years. So people are going to come out of the woodwork, I guess, and want to be looked after. And it's a shame when families splinter over such things. Yeah, I don't know. That's a bit of a tough one. I don't know what else to say about that.
Okay, so I'm just cutting in here with a post-edit and some additional context, because I realised after we'd recorded that there was no mention of the Big Bopper's daughter, Deborah, who was still alive at this point. She passed away in 2006, aged 52. And the wording of the complete news report actually raises more questions, really, than it answers. Now, it appears Deborah did marry, but was living in long-term care and had been suffering from unspecified ill health for a number of years. In details of a separate legal action in 2000 involving the JP Richardson estate and a dairy company over the use of the name Big Bopper, Deborah is listed as part of the Richardson estate and under the care of a guardian. Oh, and by the way, I've been referring to the Big Bopper's son as JP Richardson Jr. and J. Richardson. To avoid any confusion, I am referring to the same person there. His name was J. Perry Richardson. So, a little more from the press coverage over the royalties litigation, and I really should have brought this into the discussion. Okay, it says, when the Big Bopper died, he left half the royalties from his songs, such as Chantilly Lace and White Lightning. And by the way, White Lightning was actually a #1 country hit for George Jones and was subsequently recorded by Hank Williams Jr., Glenn Campbell, Waylon Jennings, and Shakin' Stevens, amongst others. Half of the royalties were left to Adrienne, 25% to his son, and the other 25% to his daughter. So he'd obviously made these provisions quite close to his departure on the Winter Dance Party tour. When Adrienne Richardson Wenner, her second married name, died in 2004, she left 10% of the royalties to each of the 4 children from her second marriage and 10% to her only son with the Big Bopper. Now, as we learned, Jay Richardson sent a letter to the record company to send all of his father's royalties now and forever to him. And to back this up, he apparently had a letter from 1994 signed by Adrienne Richardson Wenner giving all of her rights to JP Richardson Jr., all of her rights. All of her rights doesn't mean all of the rights. So is it just that the article has been written a little ambiguously, or did Jay Richardson asked the record company to forward all of the royalties to him, or just what he considered his mother's share of the royalties? And where, of course, does this leave Deborah? She was obviously in a vulnerable situation, and her share of the royalties must have been very helpful in supporting her care. And looking back to the terms of Adrienne Richardson Wenner's will, she'd left 10% to the 4 children and 10% to JP Richardson Jr. No mention of Deborah, but there was 50% unaccounted for. Or, when we read that article, do we assume that when they are talking about 10%, they are talking about 10% of the entire royalties, which then would obviously add up to Adrienne Richardson Wenner's 50%. And if that is in fact the case, where is Deborah? Really, there are just so many ambiguities in that article that it is impossible to make any kind of judgment, and I'm confusing myself now, which is not difficult. But just looking ahead to 2005, an article on a website called Cron, once again credited to the Beaumont Enterprise. It says, ironically, the Bopper never made much money for himself on his music. When he died, his estate was valued at $11,111.50, about $72,000 in 2004 dollars, but $10,000 was unpaid royalties on Chantilly Lace. The article goes on to say, today, 2005, the Bopper songs earn up to an estimated $100,000 for his heirs, who still haven't settled on how the money should be divided. Okay, so just to conclude our segment on the Richardson family, a website called Steel Guitar Forum reprinted the funeral notice and obituary for Adrienne Richardson Wenner. Jay Richardson was quoted as saying, the anniversaries, certain times of the year, every year, were just very, very difficult for her. I don't know what the coroner is going to say. At that time, her cause of death had not been specified, but I know she died of a broken heart, whatever else people tell me. We also learnt that she was a great Cajun cook, very popular and community-minded. Jay Richardson said she had a good time, was a very colourful person, but he believed that his father's untimely death had overshadowed everything in her life. As to her attitude to Jay Richardson, going into show business himself. She was instrumental in my not doing it until I was 37 years old. Mother never wanted me in the business that she felt took Dad from her, but once I did, she embraced it. A friend and neighbour said she loved her kids, loved her grandchildren. She was so down to earth and always told you the truth, one of those types of friends everyone wishes they had. Okay, so let us return to the discussion, and we share some thoughts on someone who is all too often forgotten when the Winter Dance Party is discussed, and that is the pilot, Roger Peterson. I have a lot of sympathy for him. He, by all accounts, was a very fine young man. He was newly married, very conscientious pilot. As we know, he was, constantly checking his weather forecasts and gathering information before takeoff. I think, he was probably put in an impossible position, didn't want to let people down. And we talked about the Civil Aeronautics Board's finding. One thing I didn't mention, which I probably should have, was that they did cite a contributing factor, or they did cite as a contributing factor, serious deficiencies in the weather briefing, along with the pilot's unfamiliarity with the instruments. Am I looking a little too sympathetically, do you think, Gary? And for instance, to take a hypothetical rewriting of history, had he been a bus driver who was not appropriately licensed to drive one of the buses, tipped the bus over in the snow, resulting in fatalities, and then faced criminal charges, would we have the same sympathy?
Yeah, that's a really good point about Roger Peterson being a bus driver. It's a tough one, and it's yet another interesting layer to the story. I mean, planes crash all the time, and the pilots range from expert to novice. There was a lot of weather conditions going on. I hate to use the phrase "a perfect storm," but it seemed like everything came together with maybe his lack of experience with these particular planes or the instruments. Like you said, his desire to get the job done and help out these people. I mean, he had been hired to do a job. And the weather, let's just face it, that type of weather could have taken down any plane. Now, you can counter by saying, well, planes fly in that weather all the time, and they make it where they're going and everything is great. But I don't think you're being too sympathetic to Roger. I think, if anything, it's impossible to be, because the poor guy is never mentioned. I mean, the 3 rock and rollers died, and that's only every now and then do you have it added that, well, there was a pilot too, the poor guy, Roger Peterson, a regular Joe, that nobody remembers, but he lost his life as well. And there was family that lost a person as well. So I think we can be sympathetic to him. And if he wasn't 100% trained on these instruments, what about the instructors and his bosses and his teachers and the people that allowed him to get into the cockpit flying a plane? You know how rules and regulations are nowadays. You'd like to think that, these pilots and anybody in a similar situation, ferrying people, would be rigorously vetted. So I think we can be okay with being sympathetic to him. But again, there's a lot to look at there. Was he at fault, quote unquote? Well, that might be harsh, but I think yes. But there were so many other factors. So you're okay to feel the way you do about the guy.
And we also have to remember too that his boss, the owner of the charter service, Jerry Dwyer, was there. I mean, he was watching. Yes. He was watching him take off. Bob Hale made the point that many years later sort of questioned the pilot error. I mean, Bob Hale said that there is no way that Jerry Dwyer would have put Roger Peterson in the plane if there were any concerns about his ability to be able to fly it. So
that's right.
Yeah. So there obviously some responsibility is there in the supervision as well, you would think.
And I might even draw a bit of a parallel with General Artis. They had a blueprint as to how to run a tour. They learned the hard way that the way they were doing it was idiotic. The Aeronautics Board, the Dwyer Company, and people that put pilots in cockpits, well, there had been a way to do that as well, and hadn't resulted in fatalities or a lot of cause for concern. So they went ahead and did it once more this night with terrible ramifications, and so it's another one of the hard lessons learned, I guess, through the Winter Dance Party.
So do you have any final thoughts or anything that you would like to to perhaps add or emphasize based on what we've talked about and what we presented in the original episode?
Well, one thing that really struck me was the amount of research that you did. I got to hand it to you. You really dug into this one.
I got a bit carried away.
And, well, I guess you erred on the side of every known tidbit in human history we are going to present. But you know what? It called for that because there's so much going on here. And I mean, I got to admit, too, a lot of things that you dug up that I had never heard before, that I didn't know before. So the listeners as well, I mean, if you want the story of the Winter Dance Party, well, here it is, including all of the little things that fill in the cracks and humanize the story. And it's not us punching it up to say, please, be sad, be more sad about this. I mean, it is inherently sad because of all these things that actually happened and actually existed. It's amazing that this tragedy occurred, like just the worst case scenario possible unfolded. And I guess what I take away from it is just the many, many, many ramifications of this story.
Gary, thank you once again for putting so much effort into your part on that. Your insights were great as usual. And thank you so much for coming back and talking about it a little more.
Always a pleasure, George. Thanks for having me, and it's much appreciated.
There's one particular story that Bob Hale relates, or he related this in Behind the Music, which was a big reference that we used for putting the original episode together and in subsequent interviews. And this is Bob Hale. At one point, Bopper was sitting with my wife, Kathy, and me in a booth. This is obviously the night of the show at the Surf Ballroom. Kathy, Bob Hale's wife, was expecting our first child, and Bopper said something like, "That's what I miss most, being around my wife when the baby moves. Kathy, may I feel your baby moving?" Kathy took Bopper's hand and placed it on her stomach as the baby moved. Bopper smiled. "I can't wait to get home to do that."
Yeah, I mean, why? Why you got to bring this up to me, George? How sad.
Yeah.
But also the future ramifications thing. When that kid is born, like the little story he's got about the Bopper felt me move.
Yeah.
And these peripheral players, their stories are significant too, perhaps in a more human way. But and that story certainly humanizes the Bopper as well. Again, regular folks, regular Joes, not just rock and roll heroes, but people living lives and having families and having these moments. So that's a really, really touching and interesting thing to have had happen that night.
And in later years, when J. Richardson was seeking out information about his father, he approached Waylon Jennings and he spoke to Bob Hale and lots of other people too, no doubt. But Bob Hale was able to, relate that story to J. Richardson. And you can see, even in the interview that was done in 1999, Bob Hale getting quite emotional when he talked about it. Now, Gary's written some great stuff on his website, soulrideblog.com, on Buddy Holly, on Ritchie Valens and the biopic that we discussed earlier, La Bamba, also Dion and the Belmonts, and Frankie Sardo. You can find links to those articles on this episode's webpage and also where these episodes appear on YouTube podcasts. Now, we also, on the webpage, as we said, link to all of our references and suggestions for further viewing, reading and listening, and both podcast episodes are embedded on the webpage as well. If you'd like to stick with us for a couple of minutes after the credits, we just do a little rewriting of history inspired by Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Very special thanks to Gary Wells, thanks to Steve Collins for tech support, to Gainesville for our theme music, and thank you so much for listening. Podcast terms and conditions can be found at our website, DEC4podcast.com. You can contact us there or on our social media. Find us on the major podcasting platforms, and we're also on Substack, Facebook, Tumblr, and Instagram. This has been George Fairbrother. Thanks for listening.
Hi, I'm Steve Collins from the YouTube channel Please Tell Me Where to Go. We have great travel videos and other stuff as well, so go to YouTube. Please tell me where to go. The 2 is the numeral 2, and enjoy a whole bunch of videos.
hit it off so well. Buddy Holly and JP Ritchie Valens, they'd hit it off so well with Bob Hale and his wife Kathy and Carol Anderson and the people looking after them in Clear Lake that they were actually going to come back. You know, they even got as far as talking about potential dates for a tour in the summer. They were going to go to Bob Hale's place and they were going to cook up some Wisconsin sausage, and it sort of put me in mind of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
Yes.
Sharon Tate and Jay Sebring survived the Manson nutcases, and, you know, there was sort of a really hauntingly happy ending to that. And it sort of struck me, if only there was a Tarantino ending.
Yeah, exactly. And it gets you thinking, I guess, particularly in the wake of Quentin's film, but the idea of cleansing history and fixing these things, you know, where's the scene? You know, I can picture it, how it's shot with a little bit of a glaze on the camera or whatever, a little bit of a dream sequence where, you know, Buddy lives and they all get together, and even the less superstars of in Clear Lake have this connection to these rock and roll heroes, and they have them come to their hometown, and the little kids, you know, get to meet these stars, and they have stories growing up about the picnics and the days when Buddy Holly would come and hang out. And yeah, it's a little bit of a postscript that you could conjure up, you know, I don't know, to make yourself feel a bit better, or just to imagine the what ifs. So it is a very Tarantino thing to consider. And, you know, fixing these broken things in history. Yeah, it's a nice thing to think about.